Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming and attending this morning's breakout session. Make sure you're in the right room. This is Emerging Africa Beyond the Headlines. My name is Adrienne Klasa. I am the editor of This is Africa at the Financial Times, and I will be moderating this session. But before we go into the debate, we actually have a special guest who has come here to give some opening remarks. I'd like to welcome to the stage former President of Nigeria, His Excellency Dr. Goodluck Jonathan. So, Mr. President, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Please be seated. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. What a great day to be here in Atlanta on the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Thank you for inviting me to share this great day with you. But of course, today we also remember that terrible year, 1968, when we lost Dr. King. 1968 was also a terrible year in my country, Nigeria. I was about 11 years old, and we were in the middle of the Biafran Civil War, a war that my whole community was burnt down. 1968 was also a terrible year for the whole of Africa, with one of the worst droughts in history sweeping the continent and making poverty and hunger in its wake. But today, Africans here and on the continent have every reason to stand proud and look forward with confidence. The children of the dark continent have a bright future if we all work together and do the right things. Let me use this opportunity to thank the organizers of this program that have brought all of us here. Ambassador Andrew Young, Mayor Karim Reid, and of course, the very vibrant and talented young man, John Hope Brand, who brought us here. The summit this year is to discuss economic inclusiveness. And when you talk about economic inclusiveness, you remember some of the words of the great Martin Luther King. And he said, and I quote, "If our economic systems are to survive, there has to be a better distribution of wealth." And whenever we talk about wealth distribution, it reminds me of my college days when I was undergraduate at the university. In those days, in the faculties of social sciences, though I was in the pure sciences, there's always a lot of discussions about socialism and capitalism. And one of the lecturers then who had a car, but had some part-time jobs with the state government, got some little more money and bought a second car. And the student asked the lecturer in the class, he said, Professor, why do you have to buy two cars? Can you drive two cars at the same time? And the prof looked at the student and said, young man, socialism is not the redistribution of poverty, but the redistribution of wealth. So when we talk about inclusive growth, we are actually talking about how do you distribute the wealth of nations. But you cannot distribute or redistribute what you don't have. You must create the wealth before you talk about how will you properly distribute the wealth. How will African nations key into the global economic expansion that is going on? In the past 3 decades or so, the world economy is expanding, especially from the South Asian countries. What percentage of this expansion towards the African continent? The world trade is expanding, and in fact, the trade is growing by 5% annually. But only about 2.5% of the world trade impacts the African continent. So you are not comfortable as an African leader or as a person who is interested in Africa, what do we do? What next steps to take? But for you to really know where you are going and what to do, sometimes you need to look at the whole story of Africa. So I want us to look at Africa, analyze the economic trends in Africa. And for the purpose of this discussion, I divide Africa into 4 eras. Before the 60s, that is what I describe as the pre-colonial and the colonial era in Africa. The pre-colonial Africa, we had kingdoms and empires. Some are fairly big and strong, but majority of them are weak, and some are simple city-states with no institutions or at best patrimonial arrangement. Then we move into the colonial period, when Africa was prepared for commodity trading to provide raw materials and export them abroad. Then the next era is the era I describe as the era of independence. That is between the 60s and the 90s. The first African country south of the Sahara or south of the equator to gain independence was Ghana in 1957. But between 1960 and 1963, especially 65, most African countries gained independence. Of course, the last was Zimbabwe in 1980. So it was the era of independence between the 60s and the 90s. Yes, political independence, but then we had governments that were mainly headed by dictators. Africa was noted for military coups and counter-coups. Wars, crises, hunger, poverty, unsustainable foreign debts, no proper economic planning to move the continent. Then, of course, we now move to the third era, the post-90s, what I call the democratic era, where African countries now have government based on democratic principles, that the citizens elect their leaders. The leaders have defined tenures that they will serve and hand over to another government. That encourages peer competition among African countries. That encourages more economic planning and some reforms. And because of this, the economies of most African states still growing. In the past 25 years, the average growth is about 5.7%. But between the 60s and the 90s, the average growth was about 3%. Because most of the military governments are very ephemeral. They think about how to stabilize the office, not how to grow the economies. Because anybody who picks a bigger gun can throw you out. So that has been the story of Africa. So the economy started growing, but then we asked, how inclusive is the growth? Pure economists will give a number of analyses, but as ordinary person, there are certain key things that you need to look at in every community, every society, to show clearly whether there is significant inclusiveness in the growth. First, there should be wealth. There should be jobs for young people. And of course, the standard of living of the people must improve. Without these key things, inclusiveness would still be one thing. So in Africa, from the African Development Bank studies, about 61% of people live with about $2 a day. That is 61% of people are poor. About 44% live with $1.25 a day. That is absolute poverty. And so you still have too many of the world poor in Africa. In that case, though the economies are growing, investment is expanding, some African countries are even investing outside Africa, but there's a limited inclusiveness in terms of the growth of the economy. So we need to move the continent to the next phase, the phase I describe as the developed era, where you are moving Africa from developing continents to a developed continent. And when we talk about that movement, which we are already there, it has started and it is moving. And when we are talking about that, I believe sincerely in the philosophy of the late Singaporean leader, Lee Kuan Yew, who said that to move your nation, you need to select few things, few critical things, and do those critical things very well, and continue to do those things very well. And over a period of time, you see your nation changing. And identify 5 areas that we should look at: government, civil society, and the private sector in Africa, for us to really move Africa from a developing continent to a developed continent. First is political stability to encourage investment. Yes, we have democracies, like I've discussed in this third phase, is the democratic phase. But still, we need to fine-tune our democracies. We need to encourage credible elections and peaceful transitions of government. I was in Tanzania as the head of the Commonwealth Observer Team to monitor their elections. And up to this time, we still have stalemate in Zanzibar. That is not a good signal. So though we have democratized, but then we still need to fine-tune to encourage investment. The second is infrastructure. Infrastructure is key to encourage investment and to move the continent forward. Infrastructure such as power. Without power, you cannot talk about adding value to your raw materials, and you cannot talk about industrialization. And without this, you cannot talk about job creation, you cannot talk about wealth creation. Transportation is key. Because if you look at Africa, intra-Africa trade, trade within Africa is just about 11% of the global trade. And the key problem is transportation. So difficult to move goods from East Africa to West Africa, or from West Africa to South Africa, or South Africa to North Africa. It's easier to move goods from Africa to outside the continent. So transportation is key, be it air transportation, be it water transportation, roads, and railways. And communication is also a key thing. The current economy is knowledge-based economy. You cannot move without ICT. What is the level of broadband penetration? How many Africans can key into ICT to move the continent forward? The third is reforms in the public and the private sector. Government must come up clearly an environment. Government must provide the environment for a private sector-led economic growth. For you to talk about sustainable growth, it must be led by the private sector. Government duty is to provide the enabling environment to encourage competitiveness and reduce rent seekers and clientelism. That's the only way you can talk about job creation and wealth creation for the ordinary people. And of course, the fourth one is that the continents must move away from commodity trading. Now our economy is dominated by commodity trading. And as long as we don't add value to our raw materials, be it solid mineral, be it produce from our forests or farms, if we don't have value to that, we're exporting jobs and we're exporting the wealth of the continent. So we must move away from this commodity trading. And the fifth aspect is, I believe that there is a special group, a special segment of our society in Africa that we must work with them and we must create special programs for them to make sure that we move the continent forward. These are the women and the youth. In the normal population, just like the African population, where 50% of the 50% are women. And if you don't encourage the women, it's another way of saying you don't want 50% of your population to contribute to the economic development of the society. And so society cannot move as fast as societies that encourage everybody. And in young people, yes, we have the youth boards in Africa, but it's beyond the youth boards. Presently, in Africa, we have well-educated young people with creative minds, with energy, intelligent, and they are ready to contribute to the growth of society. But they don't have their resources. They don't have finance. Because in Nigeria, for example, when the World Bank did a study on the problem of doing business in Nigeria, the first problem is access to finance. So this group of young, talented, intelligent young men and women must be specially encouraged. I'll run through by saying, when I was in office in Nigeria, we get a number of them, ask them to write their proposals, and we encourage them by training them in business skills and giving them grants to manage their businesses in the areas to encourage more small and medium-scale enterprises, SMEs, because it is SMEs that grow the economy of nations. We encourage them to go into light manufacturing, food processing, the service sector, the entertainment sector, and of course, the area for agriculture. We tag those ones agropreneurs. These are young men and women who have left colleges, young graduates, some with even master's degree holders, who go into commercial agriculture. And we talk about the agricultural value chain, not just about producing food, but you produce the food with high degree of mechanization, not what Africa is known for by cutlasses and hoes. We are dropping the cutlasses and hoes, and we have to use modern tractors and others. You have to produce the food, you have to process, and you have to export. And it was quite a success story. Presently, the African Development Bank is upscaling this to about 19 African countries. And these are areas that we can partner with people like you, other friends of Africa, to see how we can spread this. Because agri is key in moving Africa. We have very big land. There's no reason why we cannot exploit this land for our economic growth. So to me, I want to spend my post-presidential life in working with you and with African nations to see what we can contribute to the continent. I'm interested in two areas. First, political stability through credible elections and peaceful transition. This will encourage investment. Second is wealth creation through youth and women empowerment. Africa is growing. Africa is rising, no doubt about that. But we need to move faster. And we need to ensure that our economies don't just grow, but the growth is inclusive. I came up with a concept I describe as the African Development Action Project. The idea is to harness the entrepreneurs, the community and civil society leaders, young African leaders and financiers on the continent and in the diaspora, as well as the friends of Africa, to focus on one problem at a time in an African country and work to solve that problem through innovative reforms and investment. Because, as I mentioned, you must make reforms in the private sector, reforms in the public sector to encourage investment.
We're supposed to be doing this.
We're not talking about AIDS. AIDS can never help you to grow your economy. It can help you to survive vegetatively. But we need investment. So proper reforms that will encourage investment and encourage young people to key into small and medium-scale enterprises, to set up their own companies, go into light manufacturing, food processing, or other areas, and grow. And I believe that we can do it together. Through my foundation, I will convene and enable this effort, and I invite all of you to join me in making this happen. I believe we can change Africa and most African countries in a very short time. When I became the president of Nigeria, I asked people to go to Asia and say, look, study, tell me, how long does it take to change most of these countries that have moved from third world to second world, some from third world to near first world? And it doesn't take a lifetime. Within 15 years, average, we can move most of our countries from these developing countries or the third world countries to upper scale of the second world or near first world. It is possible. The only thing is to pick few things and do those few critical things very well and continue to do those things very well. Let me finally thank all of you for being here to participate in this debate on how we move our continent forward. Let us work together and light Africa. I thank you all.
About 10 minutes.
How much time?